Early June 1942, aboard the German auxiliary cruiser Widder in the North Atlantic, Admiral Karl Dönitz stared at the decoded message from Japanese Naval Intelligence, his weathered face illuminated by the dim light of his cabin lamp. The Americans were planning something big in the Pacific. 4 Japanese aircraft carriers were sailing into a trap near Midway Atoll, and Japan's brilliant naval tactician, Admiral Yamamoto, remained unaware. Dönitz's pen hovered over the communication form. Should he alert Berlin about the American interception capabilities? Or should he contact the Japanese directly, bypassing protocol? The decision he was about to make could alter the entire course of the war in the Pacific and perhaps change Germany's fortunes as well. What Dönitz couldn't know was that his choice would reveal the fatal flaws in the Axis alliance and demonstrate how intelligence sharing, or the lack thereof, could determine the outcome of world-spanning conflicts more decisively than any battleship's guns or aircraft carrier's planes. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The question had been building toward this moment since December 7, 1941, when the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor brought America fully into the war. While Germany had declared war on the United States 4 days after Pearl Harbor, the coordination between Hitler's Reich and Imperial Japan remained superficial at best, a fatal weakness that would prove catastrophic for both Axis powers. Among the German naval officers who understood the importance of proper intelligence sharing was Kapitän zur See Werner Hartenstein, a 34-year-old U-boat commander whose tactical brilliance had earned him the Knight Cross with oak leaves. As commander of U-156, Hartenstein had sunk over 20 Allied vessels in the Atlantic, earning the nickname the Atlantic Ghost from terrified merchant marines. Hartenstein wore his weathered naval uniform with the quiet dignity of a professional seaman. His piercing blue eyes could spot a convoy at impossible distances, even in rough seas. The Iron Cross First Class gleamed on his chest, not as affectation, but as testament to courage under fire. His temperament was calculating rather than impulsive, his mind methodical rather than chaotic. But Hartenstein's greatest gift wasn't his ability to sink ships, it was his understanding of signals intelligence and code breaking. He had been one of the first to recognize that German naval codes might be compromised, warning his superiors months before they finally accepted this devastating truth. Now, as Japan prepared to spring what they thought was a surprise attack on Midway, Hartenstein found himself in possession of crucial information that crossed the boundary between the European and Pacific theaters. Hartenstein's path to this pivotal moment had begun decades earlier. Born April 27, 1908 in Plauen, Saxony, young Werner grew up in the shadow of Germany's defeat in the First World War. His father, a naval officer in the Kaiser's fleet, had been present at the scuttling of the German High Seas Fleet at Scapa Flow, an act of defiance that prevented the surrender of Germany's prized warships to the British. This heritage of naval pride and tactical defiance shaped Hartenstein's identity from childhood. He struggled with mathematics in school, but compensated with an extraordinary memory for details and patterns. He entered the German Naval Academy in 1928, graduating near the top of his class in 1932. Even then, his instructors noted his unusual ability to identify patterns in seemingly random information, a talent that would serve him well in the coming conflict. After graduation, Hartenstein's career took an unusual turn when he was assigned to naval intelligence rather than a surface ship. He spent 2 years analyzing British naval communications before requesting a transfer to active service. This experience with intelligence work gave him insights few combat officers possessed. He understood not just how to fight, but how information shaped the battlefield before the first shot was fired. His first combat experience came in 1939 during the invasion of Norway. Serving aboard the cruiser Blucher, Hartenstein witnessed firsthand the devastating impact of surprise when Norwegian coastal batteries sank his ship in Oslo Fjord. Of the 1,400 crew members, he was one of only 200 survivors. The experience taught him that strategic surprise could overcome even the most powerful weaponry, a lesson he would never forget. After his rescue, Hartenstein requested transfer to the U-boat service, where commanders had greater autonomy and tactical flexibility. Admiral Dönitz, recognizing his potential, approved the request personally. After intensive submarine training, Hartenstein took command of U-156 in March 1941. Within months, he had established himself as one of the Kriegsmarine's most effective submarine commanders. In January 1942, Hartenstein participated in Operation Drumbeat, the devastating U-boat campaign off America's east coast. The operation caught the Americans completely unprepared. U-boats sank ships within sight of coastal cities, their burning hulls visible from shoreside restaurants and beaches. Hartenstein alone sank 7 merchant vessels in 2 weeks, adding to the mounting Allied losses. But Hartenstein was more than just an effective hunter. He displayed a sense of honor rarely seen in the increasingly brutal Atlantic campaign. In February 1942, after sinking the British passenger ship Laconia, he surfaced to rescue survivors, an act that placed his submarine at great risk from Allied aircraft. This action, controversial within the German High Command, demonstrated Hartenstein's commitment to the traditional maritime code that placed the rescue of survivors above military advantage. By May 1942, as Japanese preparations for the Midway operation accelerated, Hartenstein found himself temporarily assigned to a special intelligence unit in Berlin. His task? Analyze Allied naval communications in the Atlantic and assess whether American escort patterns indicated changes in code-breaking capabilities. It was during this assignment that he encountered information that would change the course of the Pacific War, if only it could reach the right people in time. Through his intelligence work, Hartenstein discovered that American cryptanalysts had broken the Japanese naval code JN-25. He found evidence in intercepted Allied communications suggesting the Americans knew about Admiral Yamamoto's planned attack on Midway. Most critically, he realized the Americans were setting a trap, with their carriers positioned to ambush the Japanese fleet from an unexpected direction. This information reached Admiral Dönitz on June 2, 1942, just days before the Battle of Midway would begin. Dönitz now faced the crucial decision that found him staring at the decoded message in his cabin. The information was solid, but protocol demanded it go through proper channels, from German Naval High Command to the Foreign Ministry, then to the German ambassador in Tokyo, and finally to Japanese Naval Headquarters. This process could take days, perhaps too long to affect the outcome. Alternatively, Dönitz could use the direct communication channel established between German U-boat command and the Japanese Navy for coordinating submarine operations in the Indian Ocean. The message was deliberately vague, avoiding direct reference to code-breaking or specific intelligence sources. It was a compromise between his duty to protocol and his understanding of alliance warfare. Whether it would be enough or arrive in time remained to be seen. Unknown to Dönitz, his message would encounter multiple delays. First, the Japanese submarine commander who received it failed to recognize its significance. Second, when finally forwarded to Admiral Yamamoto's flagship Yamato, it arrived amidst dozens of other reports and updates as the massive Japanese fleet approached its target. The consequences of this intelligence failure would become apparent in the early hours of June 4, 1942. As Japanese aircraft struck Midway Atoll, they believed they had achieved surprise. In reality, American carriers Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown were already positioned northeast of the island, their pilots briefed and ready to strike the Japanese carriers once their location was confirmed. The devastating American attack that followed would sink 4 Japanese fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, in a single day. With them went the cream of Japan's naval aviators, irreplaceable assets that would handicap Japanese naval operations for the remainder of the war. When news of the disaster reached Berlin 3 days later, the reaction was mixed. Hitler, focused on the Eastern Front and the advance toward Stalingrad, barely acknowledged the report. The German Admiralty, however, immediately recognized the battle's significance. The Japanese carrier force, which might have been used to disrupt American supply lines to Britain or support German operations in the Indian Ocean, was now crippled. For Hartenstein, who had returned to U-156 by this time, the news was both vindicating and devastating. His analysis had been correct, but the failure to act on it decisively had cost the Axis a critical strategic asset. In his war diary, he wrote a single prophetic line: "The war may well have been decided today, not by battle, but by silence. Hartenstein couldn't know how right he was. The Battle of Midway marked a turning point in the Pacific War from which Japan would never recover. More importantly, it exposed the fatal flaw in the Axis alliance, the inability to coordinate strategy and share intelligence across theaters of operation. In the aftermath, German naval intelligence conducted an internal review of the intelligence failure. The report, classified top secret, criticized the cumbersome communication protocols between Berlin and Tokyo and recommended establishing a joint intelligence center staffed by both German and Japanese officers. Hitler approved the recommendation, but implementation was delayed by inter-service rivalries and logistical challenges. By the time the Joint Center became operational in early 1943, the strategic moment had passed. For Germany, the consequences extended beyond the Pacific. With Japan on the defensive in the Pacific, Germany could no longer count on Japanese pressure to divert American resources. Plans for Germany's submarines to operate alongside Japanese forces in the Indian Ocean were scaled back, then abandoned entirely. The potential for truly global Axis cooperation, already limited, vanished completely. By early 1943, Dönitz had replaced Raeder as commander-in-chief of the Kriegsmarine. Now responsible for Germany's entire naval strategy, he confronted the consequences of failed Axis coordination daily. American shipyards were producing vessels faster than U-boats could sink them. Allied convoy protection was becoming increasingly sophisticated, aided by intelligence sharing that the Axis powers had never managed to match. For Heinrich Hoffmann, watching the aftermath of Midway from Tokyo was a study in contrasts. The Japanese naval staff maintained a stoic public face, acknowledging only that the Imperial Navy has experienced setbacks in recent operations. Behind closed doors, however, the atmosphere bordered on despair. 4 irreplaceable fleet carriers, the heart of Japan's naval striking power, were gone. With them, over 300 aircraft and nearly 2,000 experienced naval aviators had perished beneath the Pacific waves. Hoffmann recorded his observations in a private journal, documenting both the official statements and the whispered truths he gathered from his Japanese contacts. His position as naval attaché gave him unique access to the inner workings of the Imperial Japanese Navy, though always as an outsider permitted only glimpses behind the ceremonial curtain. "The Japanese have lost more than ships," he wrote on June 10, 1942. "They have lost faith in their invincibility. For 6 months, they have conquered at will across the Pacific. Now, in a single day, the Americans have demonstrated not only the courage to stand and fight, but the intelligence to anticipate and counter Japanese strategy. This changes everything." What troubled Hoffmann most was not the military defeat itself, but the Japanese refusal to analyze its causes honestly. In meetings following the disaster, Japanese naval staff attributed the defeat to bad luck and the fortunes of war, rather than examining the possibility of intelligence failures. When Hoffmann delicately suggested that their operational codes might have been compromised, his Japanese counterparts dismissed the idea as impossible. "Our codes are unbreakable," insisted Captain Kuroshima, a senior staff officer. "The Americans simply got lucky. Next time, the divine winds will favor us." This refusal to confront reality reminded Hoffmann of a growing tendency he observed in Berlin, where Hitler increasingly dismissed unwelcome facts as defeatism. The parallel concerned him deeply. Both Germany and Japan seemed to be sliding into a dangerous pattern where ideology trumped objective analysis, where uncomfortable truths were suppressed rather than addressed. On June 12, Hoffmann drafted a comprehensive report for Berlin analyzing the strategic implications of Midway. He wrote with unusual frankness, "The Japanese defeat at Midway may mark the high watermark of Axis expansion in the Pacific. With their carrier force crippled, the Japanese must now fight a defensive war for which neither their training nor their national temperament has prepared them. More importantly, the defeat exposes a critical weakness in our alliance, our failure to establish effective intelligence sharing mechanisms between Berlin and Tokyo." Hoffmann recommended immediate action to remedy this deficiency, suggesting the establishment of a permanent liaison group with dedicated communication channels outside normal diplomatic protocols. He emphasized that modern naval warfare required rapid intelligence exchange, not the cumbersome system currently in place, where information often took weeks to travel between Axis capitals. His report arrived in Berlin at a moment when the German High Command was focused entirely on Operation Case Blue, the summer offensive in Russia, aimed at capturing the Caucasus oil fields. Hoffman's warnings about Pacific strategy received only cursory attention. A brief response from Naval High Command acknowledged receipt and promised that his recommendations would be taken under advisement. U-156 was spotted by a U.S. Navy PBY Catalina aircraft. The resulting depth charge attack severely damaged the submarine. With his boat unable to submerge properly and running low on fuel, Hartenstein made the difficult decision to attempt a surface run to friendly waters. For 2 days, U-156 ran on the surface at night, hiding beneath makeshift camouflage during daylight hours. On March 10, another American aircraft spotted the damaged submarine. Hartenstein ordered his crew to battle stations, knowing their chances were slim. The ensuing attack with depth charges and machine gun fire left U-156 fatally damaged and unable to submerge. Rather than surrender his vessel, Hartenstein ordered the crew to scuttle the submarine. He went down with his boat, along with all but 7 of his crew who were later rescued by an American destroyer. The loss of U-156 and the death of Hartenstein removed one of the few German officers who fully understood the critical importance of intelligence sharing between the Axis powers. His personal experience, analyzing information that might have saved the Japanese carrier fleet at Midway, then falling victim himself to improved Allied coordination, embodied the central failure of Axis strategy. In Tokyo, Heinrich Hoffmann continued his increasingly frustrated attempts to improve German-Japanese cooperation. By mid-1943, the strategic situation had shifted dramatically against the Axis. In the Pacific, the Americans had launched a 2-pronged offensive, Admiral Nimitz pushing across the Central Pacific while General MacArthur advanced through New Guinea toward the Philippines. In Europe, the Germans had suffered catastrophic defeats at Stalingrad and in North Africa, while Allied bombing of German cities intensified. On April 18, 1943, the strategic consequences of Midway took an unexpected turn when American P-38 fighters intercepted and shot down an aircraft carrying Admiral Yamamoto near Bougainville in the Solomon Islands. The operation, codenamed Vengeance, was made possible because American cryptanalysts had again broken Japanese naval codes, the same vulnerability that had led to the Midway disaster. When news of Yamamoto's death reached Tokyo, Hoffmann immediately recognized its significance. Yamamoto had been not only Japan's most capable naval strategist, but also one of the few senior officers who maintained realistic assessments of Japan's strategic position. His death removed a voice of reason from Japanese planning at a critical moment. More important to Hoffmann, the precision of the American ambush suggested their signals intelligence capabilities remained far ahead of Japanese security measures. He drafted yet another urgent report to Berlin, this time explicitly stating that Japanese codes were thoroughly compromised and that all strategic coordination with Japanese forces should assume American knowledge. The report reached Berlin at a moment of crisis for the German High Command. The defeat at Stalingrad had cost Germany an entire army, while in Tunisia, Axis forces were on the verge of surrender. Hitler was increasingly focused on the Eastern Front to the exclusion of all other theaters. Hoffmann's warnings about Pacific strategy and signal security once again received minimal attention. In June 1943, Hoffmann was recalled to Berlin for consultation. The journey took him across the Soviet Union via the Trans-Siberian Railway, Japan and Germany's sole remaining physical connection. The trip provided ample time for reflection on the parallel decline of Axis fortunes in Europe and the Pacific. As his train crossed the vast expanses of Siberia, Hoffmann drafted a comprehensive analysis of what he termed the Midway paradigm, the failure of Axis powers to share critical intelligence and coordinate strategy across theaters. He argued that this failure represented not merely an operational deficiency, but a fundamental strategic weakness that might prove decisive in the war's outcome. The admiral arrived without his usual escorts, dressed in civilian clothes. The two men spoke for hours, their conversation ranging from technical matters of signals intelligence to the broader strategic situation facing Germany. "Your Midway analysis identifies our core weakness," Canaris said. "We fight as Germany alone, not as part of a true alliance." Hitler never understood coalition warfare. He sees allies as subordinates, not partners. The Japanese operate the same way. Two solitudes, fighting separate wars while sharing only propaganda. Hoffman was struck by Canaris's frankness. "Can anything be done to correct this, Admiral? There's still time to establish proper coordination with Tokyo." Canaris's expression darkened. "That time is past, Hoffman. The strategic moment was lost at Midway. Now we fight for what remains." He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "But your analysis must be preserved. When this is over, whoever rebuilds our military must understand why we failed. Not just the operational failures, but the strategic ones. The failure to build true alliances, to share intelligence effectively, to coordinate globally." The meeting concluded with Canaris assigning Hoffman to a special historical unit within the Abwehr, tasked with documenting German naval operations for post-war analysis. It was, in effect, an acknowledgement that Germany's naval war was already lost and that the focus had shifted to preserving lessons for the future. In October 1943, as Hoffman began his work with the historical unit, news reached Berlin of the Battle of the Philippine Sea, what Japanese survivors would later call the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. American carrier aircraft had destroyed nearly 400 Japanese planes while losing only 29 of their own. The Japanese carrier force, rebuilt after Midway but lacking experienced pilots, had been effectively eliminated as a fighting force. For Hoffman, the battle represented the final validation of his Midway analysis. The failure to address fundamental weaknesses, in this case pilot training and aircraft technology rather than intelligence sharing, had led to an even more lopsided defeat than Midway. Japan was now fighting a defensive war with steadily diminishing resources, while American industrial might produced ships, aircraft, and trained personnel in seemingly inexhaustible numbers. As 1943 drew to a close, Hoffman completed his comprehensive analysis of the Midway paradigm and its implications. The document, over 300 pages long, examined not just the battle itself, but the structural failures in Axis strategy that it revealed. Canaris ensured copies were secured in multiple locations, including neutral Switzerland, where they might survive regardless of Germany's fate. In January 1944, Hoffman received unexpected orders to return to operational duty. The historical unit was being disbanded as part of a general consolidation of intelligence functions under SS control, part of Himmler's ongoing effort to absorb the Abwehr. Hoffman was assigned as intelligence officer to a destroyer flotilla operating in the Baltic Sea, where German naval forces were increasingly focused on evacuating German civilians and troops from the advancing Red Army. Before departing Berlin, Hoffman had a final meeting with Canaris. The admiral, now under suspicion from the SS and effectively sidelined, spoke with remarkable candor about Germany's situation. "We lost this war at Midway, though few in Berlin would understand that statement. Not because we needed Japanese victory there, though that would have helped, but because Midway exposed the fatal flaw in our approach to coalition warfare." Hoffman's new assignment to the Baltic Fleet marked a profound shift from the strategic concerns of the Pacific to the increasingly desperate tactical reality of Germany's naval war. By early 1944, German naval operations had transformed from offensive actions against Allied shipping to defensive measures protecting German supply lines and civilian evacuations from the advancing Red Army. As he boarded the destroyer Z-28 at Kiel, Hoffman could not help but reflect on the strategic collapse that had occurred since Midway. The German Navy, once feared across the Atlantic, now operated primarily in the Baltic Sea, its last sanctuary from overwhelming Allied air power. The U-boat campaign, though still active, had suffered devastating losses since May 1943, when the Black May crisis saw 41 submarines lost in a single month. Hoffman's role as intelligence officer for the 8th Destroyer Flotilla gave him a front-row seat to the unfolding disaster. His responsibilities included analyzing Soviet naval movements, coordinating with Luftwaffe reconnaissance, and assessing threats to evacuation routes from Baltic ports. In practice, this meant facilitating the retreat of German forces and civilians from territories Germany had conquered just 3 years earlier. In February 1944, Hoffmann participated in Operation Hannibal, the massive evacuation of German troops and civilians from the Baltic states and East Prussia. The operation would eventually evacuate over 2 million people, becoming the largest maritime evacuation in history. German ships, from military vessels to requisitioned civilian craft, braved Soviet submarines and aircraft to transport refugees westward. During one evacuation mission, Z-28 was escorting the Wilhelm Gustloff, a former cruise liner packed with over 10,000 refugees. Soviet reconnaissance aircraft spotted the convoy, and Hoffmann received reports of submarine activity in the area. He immediately recommended a course change, drawing on his analysis of Soviet patrol patterns. Captain Friedrich Koth, Z-28's commanding officer, implemented the recommendation without hesitation. The decision proved prescient when the Soviet submarine S-13 torpedoed and sank another evacuation ship, the General von Steuben, killing nearly 3,000 refugees. The Wilhelm Gustloff, having altered course based on Hoffmann's intelligence assessment, avoided a similar fate, temporarily. 4 days later, on a subsequent evacuation voyage, the Gustloff would be torpedoed and sunk with the loss of over 9,000 lives. But Hoffmann's analysis had saved thousands on that first journey. The experience reinforced Hoffmann's conviction about the central importance of intelligence in modern warfare. Even in retreat, effective intelligence analysis could save lives and preserve forces. Yet he remained haunted by the larger strategic failures that had brought Germany to this desperate position. In March 1944, during a brief leave in Berlin, Hoffmann learned that Admiral Canaris had been removed from his position as head of the Abwehr. The intelligence service was being absorbed into the Reich Security Main Office under SS control, a move that effectively ended any hope of objective military intelligence assessment. More disturbing to Hoffmann, rumors circulated that Canaris was under Gestapo surveillance for suspected connections to resistance circles. Hoffmann attempted to contact his former mentor, but was warned off by mutual acquaintances. The message was clear: association with Canaris had become dangerous. Instead, Hoffmann focused on ensuring that copies of his Midway paradigm analysis remained secure in the hands of trusted colleagues who understood its importance for future military planners. Returning to the Baltic Fleet, Hoffmann found the naval situation deteriorating rapidly. Soviet forces were advancing along the coast, threatening German control of critical ports. Fuel shortages limited naval operations, while Allied bombing of German shipyards reduced repair capacity. The 8th Destroyer Flotilla, once 10 vessels strong, was down to 4 operational ships by April 1944. In this environment of increasing desperation, Hoffmann received unexpected orders in May 1944. He was to temporarily transfer to Berlin for a special assignment with what remained of the Naval Intelligence Division. The precise nature of the task was not specified in his written orders. He would be briefed upon arrival.
The naval headquarters had relocated to a reinforced bunker complex on the city's outskirts, where Admiral Dönitz maintained operational control of Germany's dwindling naval forces. To Hoffmann's surprise, his special assignment involved Japan once more. Naval intelligence had intercepted a series of encrypted Japanese diplomatic communications, suggesting that Tokyo was considering peace overtures to the Soviet Union. If accurate, this would represent a potential fracture in the Axis alliance with profound strategic implications for Germany. Dönitz personally briefed Hoffmann on the situation, emphasizing the critical importance of accurate assessment. "We need to know if the Japanese are abandoning the alliance," the admiral said. "Not what Berlin wants to hear, not what the Führer might prefer, but the truth, regardless of its implications." The task required Hoffmann to analyze not just the intercepted messages, but the broader context of Japanese strategic position. Drawing on his years in Tokyo and his understanding of Japanese military culture, Hoffmann immersed himself in the available intelligence. He reviewed reports from the German embassy in Tokyo, analyzed Japanese military operations in the Pacific, and studied economic data on Japan's increasingly precarious resource situation. After a week of intensive analysis, Hoffman presented his conclusions in a classified report titled Assessment of Japanese Strategic Intentions, May 1944. The document began with a stark assessment. Japan's strategic position has deteriorated beyond recovery. The defensive perimeter established after Midway has been breached at multiple points, with American forces advancing along both the Central and Southwest Pacific axes. Japanese naval power has been effectively neutralized, while air superiority has shifted decisively to the Allies. Regarding the specific question of Japanese-Soviet negotiations, Hoffman's conclusion was measured but clear. While certain elements within the Japanese government may be exploring diplomatic options with Moscow, there is no evidence of imminent Japanese-Soviet rapprochement. Both practical obstacles and ideological considerations make such an arrangement unlikely in the near term. However, the mere existence of such exploratory contacts indicates Tokyo's growing recognition of strategic reality. The report concluded with a broader assessment that echoed Hoffman's Midway analysis. The fundamental weakness in the German-Japanese alliance remains unresolved. Despite facing the same enemy coalition, Berlin and Tokyo continue to fight separate wars with minimal strategic coordination. This structural deficiency, evident since Midway, has allowed the Allies to defeat Axis powers in detail, concentrating forces against each in turn. Dönitz received the report with the grim resignation that had become his characteristic expression. "So, we fight alone," he said after reading Hoffman's conclusions. "As we have always done, in reality, if not in name. The alliance was always more symbolic than substantive. We never established the mechanisms necessary for effective coordination." Dönitz nodded. "The question now is whether that lesson will be remembered by whoever rebuilds Germany after this war." He fixed Hoffman with an intense gaze. "Your analysis must survive, Hoffman. The mistakes we made cannot be repeated by future generations." Before Hoffman could respond, air raid sirens began wailing across the city. Their conversation ended abruptly as they moved to shelter positions. It would prove to be their final meeting. In June 1944, as Allied forces landed in Normandy, opening the long-awaited Second Front in Western Europe, Hoffman returned to the Baltic Fleet. The strategic situation had grown even more desperate during his absence. Soviet forces had advanced further along the Baltic coast, while Finnish defection from the Axis had removed a critical buffer in the northern Baltic. Hoffman resumed his duties aboard Z-28, now serving as both intelligence officer and executive officer due to personnel shortages. The destroyer's primary mission had shifted entirely to escort duties for evacuation transports carrying German civilians and wounded soldiers from threatened Baltic ports. On June 9, 1944, Z-28 was escorting the hospital ship Meteor when Soviet aircraft attacked. Despite the Meteor's clear Red Cross markings, Soviet Il-2 Sturmovik ground attack aircraft launched rockets at both vessels. Z-28's anti-aircraft guns engaged the attackers while the captain executed evasive maneuvers. Several rockets struck the destroyer, causing fires and flooding in the forward compartments. Hoffman, leading damage control efforts, was seriously wounded when an explosion tore through the forward gun director station. Shrapnel penetrated his chest and abdomen, causing severe internal injuries. As medical personnel moved him to the sickbay, he maintained consciousness long enough to pass critical intelligence materials to his assistant, Lieutenant Sergei Werner Keller. "Ensure these reach Admiral Dönitz personally," Hoffman told Keller, handing over a waterproof case containing his most recent analysis and updated versions of his Midway study. "The war is lost, but these lessons must survive." Hoffman survived long enough to be transferred to the hospital ship, but died during emergency surgery later that day. He was posthumously awarded the Knight's Cross for his actions during the attack, which had helped save both the Meteor and hundreds of wounded personnel aboard.
In the chaotic final months of the war, Hoffman's intelligence materials followed a circuitous route to safety. Keller, faithful to his superior's final request, attempted to deliver them to naval headquarters in Berlin, only to find the city under constant bombardment and communications increasingly unreliable. When it became clear that direct delivery was impossible, Keller made a fateful decision. Rather than risk the document's destruction or capture, he contacted an old friend from Naval Academy days who now served as naval attaché in Stockholm. Through a series of clandestine exchanges involving Finnish merchantmen still trading with Sweden, Hoffman's analysis eventually reached neutral territory. From there, copies were secured in the German diplomatic pouch to Switzerland, where they were stored in a bank vault for safekeeping. In July 1944, as these documents made their journey to safety, events in the Pacific echoed Hoffman's strategic assessment. American forces landed on Saipan in the Marianas, bringing Japan's home islands within range of the new B-29 Superfortress bombers. The disaster triggered the fall of Prime Minister Tojo's government, a political earthquake that validated Hoffman's prediction about Japan's deteriorating strategic position. The Battle of the Philippine Sea, fought during the Saipan operation, eliminated what remained of Japan's naval air power. American carriers launched over 1,000 sorties while losing only 20 aircraft in combat, a lopsided victory that Japanese officers called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The fundamental weaknesses exposed at Midway, pilot training, aircraft quality, and tactical doctrine, had only worsened in the intervening 2 years. In Berlin, the July 20 plot to assassinate Hitler failed, triggering a brutal purge of suspected opposition figures. Admiral Canaris, already under suspicion, was arrested and eventually executed at Flossenburg concentration camp in April 1945. With him died much of the institutional memory regarding the intelligence failures that had shaped Germany's strategic defeat. By January 1945, the war's outcome was beyond doubt. Allied forces advanced from both east and west toward Germany's borders, while in the Pacific, American forces had retaken the Philippines and were preparing for assaults on Iwo Jima and Okinawa, the final stepping stones to Japan. In the Baltic, German naval forces continued the massive evacuation operation that would eventually rescue over 2 million civilians and military personnel from the advancing Red Army. Z-28, repaired after the June attack, participated in these operations until February 1945, when it struck a mine near Sassnitz and sank with substantial loss of life.
As the Third Reich collapsed in May 1945, Admiral Dönitz briefly served as Hitler's successor, using his authority primarily to negotiate surrender terms that would allow as many Germans as possible to surrender to Western forces rather than the Soviets. During these final days, he requested information about Hoffman's analysis, apparently hoping to preserve critical lessons from Germany's defeat, but the chaotic conditions made retrieval impossible. The documents remained in Swiss safekeeping until 1955, when Werner Keller, having survived the war and a brief period as a British prisoner, reclaimed them during a banking visit to Zurich. By then, Keller served as an intelligence officer in the newly formed West German Bundesmarine, the naval component of West Germany's armed forces within NATO. Keller presented Hoffman's analysis to Vice Admiral Friedrich Rouge, inspector of the Bundesmarine and a respected naval theorist. Rouge immediately recognized the document's significance for Germany's new naval doctrine within the NATO alliance. Hoffman's assessment of coalition warfare's requirements, particularly in intelligence sharing and strategic coordination, provided valuable guidance for Germany's reintegration into Western security structures. In 1956, a declassified version of Hoffman's Midway paradigm analysis became required reading at the Bundesmarine's Officer Training Academy in Mürwik. The document's central thesis that modern warfare requires seamless intelligence sharing and strategic coordination among allies became a foundational principle in NATO's approach to maritime security during the Cold War. The analysis particularly influenced the development of NATO's integrated command structure, which addressed precisely the weaknesses Hoffman had identified in the Axis alliance.
Under NATO, Allied forces operated with unified command, shared intelligence through standardized channels, and coordinated strategy across multiple theaters, exactly what Germany and Japan had failed to do. In the United States, naval historians discovered Hoffman's analysis during research into the Battle of Midway's strategic impact. Admiral Chester Nimitz, former commander-in-chief of the Pacific Fleet, reviewed the document in 1957 and commented, "This German officer understood better than many of our own strategists why Midway was the decisive battle of the Pacific War. His analysis of our strengths and Axis weaknesses is remarkably perceptive." The document gained further prominence when excerpts were included in the U.S. Naval War College curriculum in 1960. Professor Thomas B. Buell, a distinguished naval historian, incorporated Hoffman's analysis into his lectures on coalition warfare, noting that Hoffman's perspective as an Axis officer provides unique insights into the strategic advantages derived from the Allies' superior approach to intelligence sharing and unified command. Perhaps the most significant vindication of Hoffman's analysis came during the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. The newly established National Security Agency, using signals intelligence capabilities that had evolved directly from the code-breaking successes at Midway, provided President Kennedy with critical information about Soviet missile deployments. The integrated intelligence assessment, combining signals intelligence, photographic reconnaissance, and human intelligence, enabled informed decision-making during the most dangerous nuclear confrontation of the Cold War. The crisis demonstrated exactly what Hoffman had identified. In modern conflict, strategic advantage derives not primarily from weapons or numbers, but from superior intelligence, effective communication, and coordinated decision-making across all elements of national power. In 1968, 25 years after Hoffman drafted his original analysis, the German Defense Ministry officially acknowledged his contribution to modern military thought. A small ceremony at the Naval Academy in Mirvik dedicated a lecture hall in his name. With Admiral Rouge noting in his dedication speech, Hoffman understood, before most of his contemporaries, that the nature of warfare had fundamentally changed.
Victory would no longer be determined primarily by courage, numbers, or even technology, but by the ability to collect, analyze, and act upon information more effectively than one's adversary. This insight, born from Germany's defeat, has helped shape our current success within the NATO alliance. The ceremony was attended by Werner Keller, now retired as a Rear Admiral, who had preserved Hoffman's legacy through the tumultuous post-war years. In his remarks, Keller shared a personal reflection that captured the essence of Hoffman's contribution. Heinrich Hoffmann never saw the fruits of his analysis. He died knowing only that Germany was losing the war he had fought honorably. But his greatest service to his country came not through combat, but through understanding. Recognizing the strategic advantages derived from the Allies' superior approach to intelligence sharing and unified command. That these insights came from an officer on the losing side make them all the more compelling. Lessons learned through the harsh teacher of defeat. The publication coincided with a renewed emphasis on joint operations and intelligence sharing within the American military. The failures of Operation Eagle Claw during the Iran hostage crisis had highlighted continuing problems with inter-service coordination, leading to the Goldwater-Nichols Department of Defense Reorganization Act of 1986. The legislation, which fundamentally reformed the U.S. military command structure to enhance joint operations, embodied principles that Hoffman had identified 4 decades earlier. By the time the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, marking the Cold War's effective end, Hoffman's analysis had become standard reference material in military staff colleges across NATO. The peaceful resolution of the Cold War, achieved through coordinated diplomatic, economic, and military pressure rather than direct conflict, validated Hoffman's core insight. In modern strategic competition, the integration of all elements of national power provides decisive advantage. As Germany reunified and Europe reorganized in the 1990s, Hoffman's analysis gained renewed relevance. The challenges of incorporating former Warsaw Pact nations into NATO involved precisely the issues of intelligence sharing, command integration, and strategic coordination that Hoffman had identified as critical to alliance effectiveness. In 1995, during ceremonies marking the 50th anniversary of World War II's end, the German Navy established the Heinrich Hoffmann Prize for Excellence in Strategic Analysis. The annual award recognized officers whose work contributed significantly to understanding the changing nature of maritime security in the post-Cold War environment.
At the inaugural presentation, Admiral Dieter Wellershoff, former Chief of Staff of the Bundeswehr, summarized Hoffman's enduring contribution. From the disaster at Midway, Hoffman extracted insights that transcend their historical context. He recognized that modern conflict requires not just material superiority or tactical excellence, but the ability to coordinate actions across domains and between partners. This understanding, born from defeat, has helped shape victory, not through conquest, but through the preservation of peace. Perhaps the most fitting testament to Hoffman's legacy came from an unexpected source. In 1998, during a joint German-Japanese naval exercise, the first such cooperation since World War II, commanders from both nations exchanged commemorative plaques. The Japanese plaque bore a simple inscription that captured the essence of Hoffman's insight. Former adversaries, now allies, sharing information to secure common interests. The lesson of Midway, learned at last. The Battle of Midway, viewed from a German perspective through Heinrich Hoffmann's analytical lens, thus became more than a pivotal naval engagement. It represented a fundamental shift in the nature of modern conflict, from battles decided by ships and planes to contests determined by information and coordination. Hoffman's recognition of this shift and his determination to preserve these lessons even as his nation faced defeat ensured that future generations would not repeat the fatal errors of the Axis alliance. In the 21st century, as military operations became increasingly dependent on networked systems, precision intelligence, and coalition cooperation, Hoffman's analysis remained relevant. His core insight, that victory in modern warfare depends less on individual heroism or national fervor than on effective integration of information and effort, had become conventional wisdom in military thought. The German officer who had watched from Tokyo as Japan's carrier fleet sailed to disaster at Midway could not have imagined how profoundly his analysis would shape post-war security structures. Yet by identifying the strategic lessons in that distant Pacific battle, Heinrich Hoffmann helped transform not just how nations fight wars, but how they build alliances to prevent them. The legacy of Heinrich Hoffmann's Midway paradigm continued to evolve in the early 21st century, as military theorists adapted his insights to an increasingly networked battlefield. The rise of cyber operations, unmanned systems, and artificial intelligence created new domains for the application of Hoffmann's central thesis, that modern conflict is decided primarily through information advantage and effective coordination rather than raw military power. In 2001, when coalition forces began operations in Afghanistan, Hoffmann's analysis found practical application in the integration of intelligence across multiple national agencies. The combined Joint Task Force structure implemented principles that directly addressed the deficiencies Hoffmann had identified in the Axis alliance, creating formal mechanisms for intelligence sharing, establishing clear command relationships, and enabling rapid operational coordination among disparate forces. Admiral James Stavridis, who would later serve as NATO's Supreme Allied Commander Europe, cited Hoffmann's analysis in a 2003 Naval War College paper on coalition warfare. The German perspective on Midway offers a startlingly prescient vision of modern coalition requirements. Hoffmann recognized that alliance warfare is not merely about sharing burdens, but about integrating capabilities, particularly in the crucial realm of intelligence. The contrast between coalition operations in Afghanistan and the dysfunction of the Axis partnership could not have been more stark. Where Germany and Japan had operated as separate entities with minimal coordination, NATO forces in Afghanistan established integrated intelligence centers, shared reconnaissance assets, and coordinated strategy across multiple domains. The structural weaknesses that doomed the Japanese carrier force at Midway had been systematically addressed in modern alliance architecture.
In 2005, the 60th anniversary of World War II's end brought renewed interest in Hoffmann's analysis. The German Naval Academy in Mirvik hosted an international symposium titled From Midway to Multi-Domain Operations: The Evolution of Coalition Warfare. Military historians and strategists from former Axis and Allied nations gathered to examine how Hoffmann's insights had shaped post-war military development. During the symposium, Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force Rear Admiral Takashi Furukawa presented a paper that explicitly connected Midway's legacy to Japan's modern security posture. The failure of Axis powers to establish effective intelligence sharing represents the critical weakness that Hoffmann identified. Japan's post-war security arrangements, particularly our alliance with the United States, have been structured specifically to address this historical deficiency. Furukawa noted that Japan's integration into American intelligence networks, particularly in maritime domain awareness and missile defense, represented a complete reversal of the isolation that had contributed to the Midway disaster. Where once we operated in strategic solitude, he observed, we now function as part of an integrated security network that shares information, coordinates responses, and maintains constant situational awareness. The symposium concluded with the establishment of the Hoffmann Initiative, an international program for junior naval officers from NATO and partner nations to study coalition operations and intelligence sharing. The program's stated goal echoed Hoffmann's core insight: to develop leaders who understand that modern security challenges require integrated responses based on shared information and coordinated action. In 2008, as the global financial crisis strained international institutions, military planners revisited Hoffmann's analysis with renewed interest. The economic pressures facing NATO and other security partnerships raised questions about alliance cohesion that paralleled the challenges of the Axis partnership. Could modern alliances maintain effective coordination under economic strain? The answer came not in traditional military operations, but in counter-piracy efforts off Somalia's coast. Operation Atalanta, the European Union's first naval task force, demonstrated precisely the kind of integration Hoffmann had advocated. Ships from multiple European nations shared intelligence, coordinated patrols, and operated under unified command against Somali pirates threatening international shipping. More significantly, this European operation synchronized with parallel efforts by NATO's Operation Ocean Shield and the U.S.-led Combined Task Force 151, creating an unprecedented level of maritime security cooperation. Forces that had been adversaries during World War II now shared tactical information in real time across organizational boundaries. The Midway paradigm has been completely inverted. Integration, rather than isolation, has become the operational standard. The evolving nature of security threats in the 2010s brought new dimensions to Hoffmann's analysis. Hybrid warfare, information operations, and cyber attacks created challenges that traditional military structures struggled to address. Yet the fundamental principle Hoffmann had identified, that modern conflict requires seamless integration of intelligence and operations, proved remarkably adaptable to these emerging domains. NATO's enhanced forward presence in the Baltic states, established after Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014, incorporated lessons directly traceable to Hoffmann's analysis. The multinational battle groups deployed to Estonia, Latvia,
Lithuania and Poland operated with integrated intelligence cells, shared communications infrastructure, and coordinated response protocols, addressing precisely the weaknesses Hoffman had identified in the Axis alliance. In 2017, the 75th anniversary of Midway, the U.S. Naval Institute published a special edition of its Proceedings Journal dedicated to the battle's strategic legacy. The edition included a newly discovered portion of Hoffman's analysis, focusing specifically on the role of technological adaptation in alliance effectiveness. The document, found in the private papers of Admiral Rouge by his granddaughter, contained Hoffman's assessment of how technological disparities affected Axis cooperation. German and Japanese signal systems remained fundamentally incompatible throughout the war, requiring human translation of all shared intelligence. By contrast, Allied forces rapidly developed standardized communication protocols, enabling direct information exchange without cumbersome intermediary steps. This observation proved remarkably prescient in the context of 21st-century network-centric warfare. NATO's development of standardized tactical data links, common communications protocols, and integrated command systems addressed exactly the technological barriers Hoffman had identified at Midway. What had been impossible for the Axis, real-time sharing of tactical information across national forces, had become standard procedure in modern coalition operations. The practical application of these capabilities was demonstrated during NATO's Operation Unified Protector in Libya in 2011. Forces from multiple nations shared targeting data, coordinated air operations, and integrated maritime surveillance with minimal friction, a level of interoperability that would have seemed miraculous to World War II commanders. Vice Admiral William Burke, Deputy Chief of Naval Operations for Warfare Systems, noted in a 2012 speech, "The integration we achieved over Libya represents the culmination of decades of work addressing exactly the deficiencies Hoffman identified after Midway. We've created not just technical interoperability, but operational synchronization, the ability to function as a unified force despite different national origins, equipment, and protocols." As artificial intelligence began transforming military operations in the late 2010s, Hoffman's analysis gained new relevance. His core insight that information advantage determines modern warfare outcomes more than traditional combat power provided a framework for understanding the strategic implications of AI in military applications. The German Bundeswehr's 2019 white paper on artificial intelligence explicitly referenced Hoffman's analysis. The lesson of Midway, as Hoffman recognized, was that superior information processing, not superior weapons, provided decisive advantage. Artificial intelligence represents the next evolution of this principle, enabling forces to collect, analyze, and act upon information at speeds and scales previously unimaginable. This perspective shaped Germany's approach to military AI development, emphasizing coalition integration rather than purely national capabilities. Rather than pursuing an independent path, German military planners advocated for NATO-wide standards for AI interoperability, data sharing protocols, and ethical guidelines, addressing at the technological level the coordination challenges Hoffman had identified at the organizational level. In 2020, as the COVID-19 pandemic created unprecedented challenges for international cooperation, military strategists found unexpected applications for Hoffman's insights in crisis response operations. The pandemic required coordination across multiple domains: medical, logistical, informational, and security, exactly the kind of integration Hoffman had advocated. NATO's COVID-19 task force, established to coordinate military support to civilian authorities across the alliance, implemented principles directly traceable to Hoffman's analysis.
The task force created integrated information-sharing mechanisms, coordinated resource allocation across national boundaries, and synchronized response efforts, applying military coordination techniques to a public health crisis. Admiral Rob Bauer, chair of NATO's Military Committee, noted in a 2021 assessment, The pandemic response demonstrated that Hoffman's insights extend beyond traditional military operations to any complex crisis requiring coordinated action. The fundamental principle that effective integration of information and effort determines outcomes applies whether the threat comes from an adversary's carriers or from a microscopic virus. As great power competition intensified in the early 2020s, Hoffman's analysis provided a framework for understanding the strategic advantages of alliance systems. The contrast between NATO's integrated command structure and the more transactional relationships among competing powers echoed the differences between Allied and Axis approaches that Hoffman had identified decades earlier. General Todd Walters, NATO's Supreme Allied Commander Europe, observed in a 2022 security conference, "What Hoffman recognized after Midway remains true today. Alliance warfare is not merely about aggregating national capabilities, but about integrating them into a coherent whole greater than the sum of its parts." NATO's advantage lies not just in our combined military power, but in our ability to coordinate its application through shared understanding. This perspective gained further validation during the Ukraine crisis, when intelligence sharing among NATO members enabled unprecedented coordination of diplomatic, economic, and military responses. The rapid synchronization of sanctions, military assistance, and strategic messaging demonstrated exactly the kind of alliance integration that Hoffman had advocated, but applied across all elements of national power, not just military forces. In 2023, the German Navy commissioned a new intelligence vessel named Heinrich Hoffmann, dedicated to maritime domain awareness and information sharing with NATO partners. The ship's commissioning ceremony included representatives from both the German and Japanese navies, a symbolic acknowledgement of how completely both nations had transformed their approach to alliance operations since Midway. Vice Admiral John Christian Koch, chief of the German Navy, noted during the ceremony, "This vessel embodies the principles Hoffman identified as essential to effective alliance operations: the ability to collect, analyze, and share information seamlessly across national boundaries. Where once we operated in isolation, we now function as integral elements of a coordinated whole." The ship's motto, Nexus Scientiae, connected knowledge, captured the essence of Hoffman's insight, that modern security depends not on individual national capabilities, but on their effective integration through shared information and coordinated action. In 2024, as NATO celebrated its 75th anniversary, military historians reassessed the alliance's evolution through the lens of Hoffman's analysis. What emerged was a clear progression from the ad hoc cooperation of World War II to the integrated command structure of the Cold War to the network-centric operations of the 21st century, each stage addressing more comprehensively the deficiencies Hoffman had identified in the Axis partnership. Admiral Stuart Munch, commander of NATO's Joint Force Command Naples, observed, "When we examine NATO's development against Hoffman's critique of Axis failures, we see a systematic effort to build precisely what Germany and Japan lacked: effective mechanisms for sharing intelligence, coordinating strategy, and integrating operations across national forces. The alliance has been constructed specifically to avoid the fatal weaknesses Hoffman identified." This historical perspective gained practical application as NATO adapted to emerging domains like space and cyberspace.
The weakness that doomed the Japanese carriers at Midway, strategic isolation despite nominal alliance, had been replaced by genuine integration. Captain Matthias Weber, commanding the German frigate Baden-Württemberg during the exercise, reflected on this transformation in his final report. Hoffman would recognize in our operations the realization of principles he identified through defeat. We share not just information but understanding, not just plans, but purpose. The isolation that characterized the Axis partnership has been replaced by integration that makes the whole greater than the sum of its parts. As military strategists look toward future challenges, autonomous systems, hypersonic weapons, quantum computing, and other emerging technologies, Hoffman's analysis continues to provide a fundamental framework. His core insight that modern warfare is determined by information advantage and effective coordination more than by traditional combat power remains as relevant in the age of AI as it was in the aftermath of Midway. The German officer who watched from Tokyo as Japan's carrier fleet sailed to disaster could not have imagined how profoundly his analysis would shape not only post-war security structures, but the entire evolution of military thought. Yet by identifying the strategic lessons in that distant Pacific battle, Heinrich Hoffmann helped transform not just how nations fight wars, but how they build alliances to prevent them. Perhaps the most fitting tribute came during the 2025 Mervik Naval Academy graduation ceremony, where the Heinrich Hoffmann Medal for Strategic Excellence was awarded to a young officer whose thesis examined alliance integration in multi-domain operations. The citation captured the enduring legacy of Hoffmann's insight. From the disaster at Midway, Hoffmann extracted understanding that transcends its historical context. He recognized that modern warfare is determined by information advantage and effective coordination more than by traditional combat power. This understanding, born from defeat, now shapes our path to security in an uncertain world. As the new generation of officers took their commissioning oath, they did so as inheritors of a tradition that had transformed completely since Hoffmann's time. From the isolation that characterized the Axis partnership to the integration that defines modern alliance operations. The lesson of Midway, learned at terrible cost by Germany and Japan, had become the foundation of security for their democratic successors. In this transformation lies perhaps the most profound legacy of Heinrich Hoffmann's analysis, the demonstration that even in defeat, understanding can become victory if the right lessons are preserved and applied. From the ashes of the Third Reich and Imperial Japan emerged not only new democratic states, but new approaches to international security based precisely on addressing the fatal flaws Hoffmann had identified. The officer who died, never knowing if his analysis would survive, would surely find satisfaction in knowing that his greatest service came not through combat, but through understanding, recognizing the strategic lessons of defeat and preserving them for future generations who would build better systems from that hard-won knowledge. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.